All right, Alexander, let's talk about Syria. And I was reading an article about the terrible situation there with regards to the sanctions and how they're strangling the Syrian people. It's just getting to the point of cruel and I mean, I just don't have any words for it, really. I was reading the article and just thinking, this is warfare. The U.S. is already at war with Syria, it appears, but this is a different kind of war. They're just strangling the country as best they can, and it appears to be working. I mean, their economy is in a terrible mess, and of course, we now have the resurgence of IS and the moderate rebel things again, and it seems like things are ramping up in Syria. They're going from very, very bad to I don't know, to terrible. Just get into this story. The whole region is being set on fire. The whole region is being set on fire.
Absolutely, and this is now becoming, frankly, vindictive. I mean, it always was to a great extent, but whatever geostrategic chess game the Western powers were playing 10 years ago when the Syrian conflict began, I don't think any longer they really can believe that they can achieve that geostrategic objective, whatever it was that they set themselves. But they can't give up. They can't accept that whatever it was that they were setting out to achieve has failed. They can't accept that President Assad will remain in power in Damascus. So what they have done is that they are now trying to put the entire country under a brutal economic siege, which goes beyond, by the way, the sanctions that they imposed on Iraq when Saddam Hussein was in power. So in effect, it's ceased to be a war now against the Syrian government, the Assad government, which is what it was in the years after 2011 when the uprising there began. It is now a war, an economic war, which is increasingly being waged against ever larger sections of the Syrian population. And you're absolutely right, the economy has collapsed. By the way, the Lebanese economy, which we were talking about, which is interconnected, very closely interconnected with the Syrian economy, has also collapsed. And I do wonder whether it isn't to some extent a consequence of this economic war that's been waged on Syria itself. Anyway, the Syrian economy has collapsed. The Lebanese economy has collapsed. There is increasing hunger. There is talk of famine in various places. The country is being deprived of its oil revenues because the oil wells in the far east of Syria are under occupation by the US military, which, by the way, has been creaming off, or at least has been allowing various actors in eastern Syria to cream off part of that oil in order to fund their own activities within Syria itself. And so the government is short of money. The people are short of food, because food also is mainly provided by the east of Syria. That was Syria's breadbasket. So people are very hungry. In places, it seems they're starving. There's no real way of organizing a response to the pandemic because the sanctions, which, by the way, were imposed in the last weeks of the Trump administration, but which are being rigorously enforced by the current Biden administration, extend to secondary sanctions against countries that trade with Syria and companies that carry out work in Syria. These sanctions make it impossible for Syria, for example, to import medications to handle the pandemic in Syria, which is also out of control. And the situation is getting very, very bad. And on top of that, and we've done programs about this. I did a program about it recently on my channel. We've also had a campaign of sabotage by Israel against Iranian oil tankers, which have been shipping oil to Syria also. That's not been apparently 100% effective and fully successful, but we see the extent of these policies that are being carried through. Lastly, and not least, there's been a recurrence of military activity. Not so much in Idlib province, by the way, where, as I understand it, the rebels have basically been forced back to Idlib city itself and to a stretch of territory along the Turkish border. But there's been more fighting in eastern Syria, and also it seems that there's now a pattern of IS fighters reorganizing themselves in central Syria, where large area of central Syria remains in dispute because the United States has a base at a place called al-Tanf that prevents the Syrian military from reoccupying this region. It's created a vacuum, a power vacuum, which jihadi fighters, most of them apparently aligned with IS, are now gradually filling, and where they're starting to reorganize. So the situation is very bad. Now, I will say that I do think there will come a bottom point to all of this, in the sense that Syria is not without friends. Russia can supply Syria with oil, and I think if things begin to get really bad there, they will start to do so. And I suspect they will also start to supply Syria with food. There's been increasing talk about doing so in Russia, and I think they are in a position to do that. And of course, China can also help also. And perhaps more importantly, some of the Arab Gulf states are becoming increasingly concerned about the situation in Syria. They've completely given up the idea of overthrowing Assad. And there's talk about Syria even rejoining the Arab League. And the United Arab Emirates in particular seems to be leading a campaign to have these sanctions softened and to start, helping in Syria's reconstruction. So it's not an indefinitely bad picture, but it does show you the extent to which some people in Washington just won't give up on this and are prepared to go to the most extraordinary and extreme lengths to try to starve and bankrupt the country in order to achieve an objective which I'm no longer able to make any sense of anymore. I mean, back in 2011, you could see what they were trying to do. Now, as I said, it's increasingly looking purely vindictive.
Well, I'll get into the playbook that I think Washington is using, the deep state is using against Syria, and the warmongers are using. Let me read you an article, though, before we get to that, from Patrick Cockburn via UNS, but I'm taking this from Zero Hedge, with the title, "In Syria, the War of Hunger is Taking Over from the War of Guns." And a lot of the suffering has been put into overdrive, Alexander, from a new U.S. law called the Caesar Civilian Protection Act. And this is a U.S. law imposing the harshest sanctions in the world on Syria and bringing millions of Syrians to the brink of famine. Now, the crisis has gotten a lot worse in the 9 months. It's just been sent into overdrive since the law was implemented. That law was implemented on the 17th of June last year. It has raised the number of Syrians who are close to starvation to 12.4 million, or 60% of the population, according to the UN. More than 500,000 children under the age of 5 are suffering from stunting as the result of chronic malnutrition. The Syrian currency is collapsing. Prices rose by 230% over last year. Syrian families can no longer afford to buy basic foodstuffs such as bread, rice, lentils, oil, and sugar. Now let me read you 2 short paragraphs here that sum up this article. "The war of hunger scares me more than the war of guns," says Ghassad Massoud, the Syrian actor famous for playing Saladin in the 2005 Ridley Scott film Kingdom of Heaven. A politically neutral and popular figure in Syria, Massoud is quoted as saying that government employees are earning 50,000 Syrian pounds or $13, 9 GBP a month. $13 a month when they need 800,000 Syrian pounds to survive. Quote, I am a vegetarian, but I do not accept that a citizen is not able to eat meat because a kilo costs 20,000 Syrian pounds. The Caesar Act threatens sanctions on any person or company that does business with Syria and thereby imposes a tight economic siege on the country. Introduced just as the pandemic made its first onset in Syria last summer, and soon after the implosion of the Lebanese economy to which Syria is closely linked, the law has proved the final devastating blow to Syrians who were already ground down by a decade of destruction. Alexander, let me just ask you the final question, and you can wrap up the video. I won't break it up. Underneath this article, there's a video of Madeleine Albright explaining that the deaths, the 500,000 deaths in Iraq of innocent civilians was worth it. I'm sure you remember that quote. I won't play the video. I'll put a link to this article, guys, down below, and you can see the video for yourself. It's a famous video. I'm sure everyone remembers it, where Madeleine Albright talks about, where the question was asked, was it worth killing 500,000 Iraqis, starving them to death? And Madeleine Albright says, pretty much, I'll paraphrase, she says, yes. Is this the playbook that they are using? Is this the game plan, the Iraq game plan during the days of Madeleine Albright? Is that what they're using on Syria now?
Yes, it is. It's exactly the same game plan. By the way, just to say, Patrick Coburn is a mainstream journalist in Britain, and that article which you've just read from originally appeared in The Independent, which is a mainstream British newspaper. He's one of the very few mainstream journalists anywhere in the West who reports on the conflicts in the Middle East factually. And this is an outstanding example of his journalism. But you're absolutely right. This is the same game plan. It's to strangle and suffocate Syria, just as they tried to strangle and suffocate Iraq when Saddam Hussein was there. Of course, in the case of Saddam Hussein and Iraq, the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq did not lead to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. It required an invasion to achieve that. And it's very difficult to see how these sanctions are going to lead of themselves to the overthrow of the government of President Assad. But what they are intended to do is to essentially choke Syria and to make the recovery of Syria, whilst it is led by President Assad, impossible. And the calculation seems to be, to the extent that there is one, to make the price of supporting Syria for the Russians so high that eventually the Russians are coerced, in effect, to come to the negotiating table and agree to Assad going. I mean, that seems to be the objective. That's been the fixation all along. You haven't achieved it by military means. You try and achieve it by economic means. And perhaps if the Russians give up on Syria, as the hope and expectation is, then at some point Assad chooses to cling on, then of course an invasion happens. That seems to be, to the extent that there is a rationale behind this, that seems to be the objective. My own view is that it won't be fulfilled. First of all, we must always remember Syria actually is not such a large country. Russia, to give an example, is now the world's biggest food exporter. If Russia wants to support Syria economically, it can do so without even noticing the cost, because even small amounts of food aid in Syria now, or energy, would be enough to turn the situation around quite dramatically. And I predict that before long, that is precisely what is going to come. So I don't think this is going to succeed on those terms, but it does show how obsessive some people in Washington, and by the way also in London, have become about this issue. And of course, in the Middle East itself, it is a terrible, terrible example given to people in the Middle East about what Western policy involves for any countries in the Middle East. We have seen Iraq destroyed because its leader, however terrible a man he might have been, stood up to Western policies. We've seen Libya destroyed also. We've seen Yemen destroyed, and there's, by the way, hunger and famine in Yemen too. And now we see the same scenario playing out once more in Syria, with the United States refusing to give up on a policy which has already failed. The Gulf states, even the Saudis to some extent, have come round to acknowledging that this was not really a successful enterprise. But the United States, the neocons in Washington, and their political allies in Congress and in the current administration simply cannot give up on it. If that means starving millions of people, well, you quoted Madeleine Albright. That was her thinking in the 1990s, and the people in Washington appear to feel exactly the same way.
Was China and Russia not coming to Syria's aid in that sense, in a sense of providing food and other just basic living essentials and helping the country out in the form of aid? Were they not doing that because there might have been some kind of fear of more US and EU sanctions? And now, given the week that we have just seen come to pass, both with regards to how the US and Europe has treated China and how the US and Europe has treated Russia, will this now prompt Russia and maybe China to say, you know what, enough already? Whatever hesitations we may have had in trying to keep a balance between coming to Syria's aid and keeping the US and Europe a bit pacified, forget it. We got to step in now and just start providing humanitarian relief to Syria and screw what the US and EU is going to do to us, because they've just about sanctioned everybody there is to sanction at this point, and they've said every bad word there is to say at this point. I mean, I'm trying to think outside of Nord Stream 2 and SWIFT.
Yeah.
I can't see what more they could do. So you might as well go in there and start helping the people out. I mean, this is just getting to the point of you have to do it at this point. You have to do it.
You crystallised it exactly. I think that's exactly what it was. I think when the Caesar Act was brought into force last year, the Russians, at least Russian companies and Russian businesses, said to themselves, we're not going to involve ourselves in Syria because we don't want to be sanctioned also. But now sanctions have become so all-embracing, and they cover so much of Russia, and they're starting to affect China too. I mean, China has just been sanctioned, by the way, by the European Union. And the point has come when especially the Russians have increasingly adjusted their economy to dealing with sanctions. And there's more and more businesses in Russia which no longer are involved in the trading with the European Union in any way. So I think that's exactly what's going to happen. They will probably say it's not commercial aid. They'll probably say it's humanitarian aid. But they will say to the West, well, if you want to go ahead and sanction us over our trade with Syria, we'll go ahead. It'll make absolutely no difference because you've sanctioned in Russia by now pretty much everything that can move. And you mentioned Nord Stream 2. We've talked about that at length on many programs. It's the Germans who wanted Nord Stream 2 originally, not the Russians. The Germans, I think, will fight to keep Nord Stream 2 going as long as they can, and I suspect it will be done, certainly at some point this year. And as for SWIFT, well, Lavrov was in China and he was talking there with the Chinese about the way in which Russia has developed its own payment mechanism. Peskov, who is the Kremlin spokesman, said the same. They're ready for a cut-off from SWIFT if it comes, and they're setting up their own payment system. They're interconnecting their payment system, their own domestic payment system, with the one the Chinese already have. So they are ready to be cut off from SWIFT if that is what comes. So in effect, Russia has now become practically, virtually sanctions-proof. And I think that whilst that was a deterrent last year, because there were still some lingering hopes that things could sort themselves out, now I think after the latest moves by the Biden administration and the European Union, they've essentially given up on that. And I think that rather than see a total collapse in Syria, which would negate the gains the Russians have already achieved there, I think they will step in before very long, and we will start to see that they will provide Syria with the economic assistance it needs. They will probably say that it's humanitarian aid rather than commercial trade, so they will probably move towards providing Syria with food and energy products, which, as I said, they could easily do. It won't dent on their foreign trade position in any, or their foreign currency position in any significant way. And I think that over the next few months, we will start to see that happen. Probably they will also, once they've sorted out their own situation with the pandemic, start to provide Syria with pandemic assistance too. I would add that Syria, some time ago, already agreed a free trade treaty with Russia. So if they want to develop economic links with Syria, then of course that treaty provides a vehicle to do it. But I think initially they will be looking to do it through the form of economic, in the guise of humanitarian aid, rather than straightforwardly as economic support. Simply because they can say, it's a humanitarian crisis in Syria, which the West itself has created.
Yeah, it's really interesting. China and Russia are literally building a parallel economic system, a parallel world order, right in front of our eyes.
Absolutely.
Right in front of our eyes.
Absolutely.
They're building it.
Absolutely. And they're building it. And I mean, there's been extraordinary commentaries all about this now. I mean, the Chinese media, by the way, which covers this more forcefully than the Russian media does. It's the Chinese, just as it's the Germans who are, pushing forward with Nord Stream 2. It's a German initiative. These ideas tend to come more from China than Russia. But the Chinese media is absolutely full now about things about how the Chinese and the Russians are setting up financial architecture, which is going to be distinct and completely separate from that of the West. And I was reading only just a few hours ago a long article in one of the Chinese newspapers about how this is all going to be done, and how we're going to have rival financial and economic systems, how we don't need SWIFT anymore, how we don't need the dollar anymore, how we can do all of this by ourselves. We have the critical mass economically, China and Russia together, to do it, how more and more countries will be interested in joining us if that happens. Discusses what counter steps the United States might make in order to preserve the dollar and to protect SWIFT. And it also even goes further and discusses what counter moves the Chinese and the Russians might take in response to those countermeasures. It's quite fascinating to read, but that is exactly what is happening. And on top of that, there was a report just a couple of days ago, coming back to a topic that we discussed fairly recently on our programs, that the Russians have now given Twitter until the end of this month, and have said that unless it takes down all the content that they disapprove of, then Twitter is going to be banned from Russia. So we see all these changes are happening in this world, and it's happening now at a warp speed, to coin a phrase, and an entirely separate and distinct financial, economic, information ecosystem is being created in rivalry to that of the West. And it's happening at the rate it is happening because the events of the last few months, especially, I have to say, since the Biden administration came, have accelerated it. I mean, they've turbocharged this process to a remarkable extent. And I do wonder to what extent people in Washington and London and Paris and Berlin and Brussels understand this. I think that, again, when we do see the Russians step in and bail out Syria, which, as I said, they can do, it's not going to make any fundamental change to them. It won't require the scale of investment, for example, we've seen in when the Russians have given to Crimea. They don't need to build up the Syrian economy to that level. They can provide humanitarian assistance, which will stabilize the situation and secure the position of the Assad government. And then, of course, that will restore a kind of stability, which can be built on over time, and which will give Syria an opportunity to withstand the siege. That's all they need to do. And as I said, they can do it. And I predict that when it happens, the West will be stunned. And again, it will be something that they haven't really calculated in advance, and they will be at a loss to know what to do about it. But that's the result of thinking in the way that the neocons do, which is never give up on any project, however misguided and misconceived and failed it might be. Go on pressing forward, having no reverse gear, and then find yourself astonished and angry when it turns out that what you're trying to do doesn't work.
Yeah, it was really a historic week.
It's been a historic week.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a historic week, and you have the Turkish lira collapsing. You have Lebanon, their financial system has collapsed. You have Yemen in shambles. You have Syria in shambles. We saw the leader of the free world, Biden, is in shambles. I mean, the whole thing is, that administration is a complete mess. And I mean, you're aware of the Thucydides Trap. I'm sure you're aware with it. How does the I'm
a student of Thucydides.
Yeah, well, my question is this.
By my bedside.
Okay, my question is this. You could explain what the Thucydides Trap is, but my question is this: have we ever seen in the history of the world where one power is on the rise, according to the Thucydides Trap? One power is on the rise, and the other one is diminishing. And there's this change in a new world order. Have we ever seen it where the one power on the descendant is led by an administration like Biden's? It's such utter chaos. Probably yes. But on the flip side, have we ever seen that rising power working so closely with another power, in the case of Russia, and building a completely new world order? In other words, does this alliance insulate China from engaging in conflict with the U.S. if, and I say if the Thucydides Trap does unfold, if this scenario does unfold? Does the fact that China is aligning so close with Russia prevent the conflict of the two superpowers from taking place? Have you ever seen that before? Right.
Well, let's just explain the Thucydides Trap. It all originates from a work that was written in the 5th century BC by a ancient Greek historian, in which he discussed the war that took place in the 5th century BC between Athens and Sparta. And Thucydides said that the reason the war happened was because Sparta, which had been the dominant power at that time, became worried about the rise of Athenian power and saw Athens as a rival, and launched a preemptive war, essentially, to try and to prevent this rise of Athenian power which was a challenge to Sparta. And this has been extrapolated by many people as saying that this is how hegemonic powers always react, that when they are challenged, they intensify competition against what they see as a challenger, and that this can lead to conflict, as it did between Athens and Sparta. It's happened on many other occasions. It happened between Spain and France in the 17th century. It happened between Britain and France in the 18th century. It happened between Germany and Britain in the 20th century. So that is, in summary, what the Thucydides trap is. Has there been ever a situation quite like the one we are seeing now? The answer is no. I mean, when things like this happen on other occasions, usually what you find is that the power that feels that it is being challenged, whatever else it is, it continues to be effectively led. I mean, if we go over some of those parallels that I discussed, Spain, when it was trying to strike back against France, was led by Olivares, who was a brilliant statesman, even though he ultimately failed in what he achieved. France, when it was in competition with Britain in the 18th century, produced leaders of the caliber of Napoleon. Britain, when it found itself, in conflict with Germany, was led by people like Lloyd George and Churchill. Compare that with the situation in the United States today. Sleepy Joe, Tony Blinken. And I mean, the parallel is a painful one, and such a completely clumsy and objectively absurd situation where the United States, instead of drawing people to itself by skillful diplomacy, is actually alienating them and is driving countries, powerful countries like Russia, into closer alliance with its principal challenger and adversary, which is China. It is the opposite of what the policies of these other powers were when they were faced with that kind of situation. So I've never known anything like this before. And you're absolutely right. The Chinese, and in fact, there's been ample commentaries about this in the Chinese media. The Chinese media is full of this sort of stuff. They're saying that we don't need to worry about a military challenge from the United States anymore because we have Russia at our back. And Russia is this great military power. It secures for us our northern border. It is able to help us withstand any prospect of any conflict from, be it from the United States or from anywhere else. And, the Chinese go to enormous lengths to say that their relationship with Russia is not an alliance, but of course that's exactly what it is. And I've just done a program about this for my own channel, in which I actually quote some of those articles which have been appearing in the English language part of the Chinese media, and in which they make that precise point that you have made. So these policies, including this policy of trying to suffocate Syria in this kind of fashion, what they are actually doing is that they are accelerating, they are bringing closer that moment when the balance not just starts to tip, arguably it's already beginning to do so, but when it actually overturns entirely, and we start to see that the position of the United States and its allies as the focus of the international system, which they have been since the Second World War, when that finally ends. To be very clear, the United States will remain a great power, but it will not be the overwhelming world hegemon that it has been, especially since the end of the Cold War.
All right, we'll leave it there. Alexander Burkhurst, thank you very much. Guys, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you're still subscribed to this channel. Hitting that like button takes all but 1.25 seconds, and it is absolutely free, so make sure you hit that like button. And check your subscription. Look for us on Rumble. Look for us on BitChute. And, of course, look for us on Odyssey. Odyssey is a fantastic platform. Great design. Really nice comment system, and it is on the blockchain. The more you use Odyssey, you actually get the library coin as well, which is really cool. A cool idea. Go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch, hoodies, magic mugs. Look for Alexandra's channel down below. Look for my channel down below. Look for the Duran Clips channel down below where we put all the call-in videos on there. Go to our Discord server. And once again, the Duran shop, guys. We have some great merch. It helps us out a lot.
Absolutely. And please, as I said, remember to check out our channels, and please remember to subscribe both to this channel and to our other channels also. And we look forward to you joining us in future programs, and thank you for joining us today.
All right, till next time, everybody. Take care.